This passage from Revelation 13, verses 1 through 4, paints a picture of a terrifying vision. A beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 crowns, with blasphemous names written on its heads. It resembles a leopard, but with the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. The dragon, symbolizing Satan, gives the beast its power, throne, and great authority. One of the beast's heads seems to have suffered a fatal wound, yet it miraculously heals, leaving the entire world in awe and leading them to follow the beast. This healing is so profound that it leads people to worship the dragon who empowered the beast and the beast itself, praising its unmatched strength and invincibility. Has this beast already been described and defined in the Old Testament scriptures? Let's find out. Welcome back, everyone, to our Revelation study. Today we start chapter 13, and we're going to go through verses 1 through 4. Why, you ask? Not the whole chapter? Well, Brother Ken's going to explain that to us. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Jimmy. I love how you give me the hard stuff here. Tell him, Ken.
Tell him.
But
Tell him.
yeah, no, I'm so thankful for the back end of all these videos that people don't get to see is Jimmy working with my schedule, and you're so gracious to do that. And no, things are just getting a little bit more busy for me. As many of you know, one of the things that I feel God's called me to is to become a hospice chaplain, to be able to minister to people at the end of their life and their families, and even the nurses around them and social workers. And that's just getting a little bit more busy. Just going to have to do more time and spending time with people and getting some schooling done. So we'll get done the videos, as we can. And so today I knew we could get through 4 verses. So we'll get through sometimes larger chunks than that. These are pretty in-depth 4 verses. So, but we'll take them in bite-sized pieces, as we have time.
Okay. Well, I looked at the PDF you sent me, and it looks like there's some really good groundwork you're about to lay for us.
Absolutely. Chapter 13 is a really fun chapter. I think they're fun. I enjoy studying them. And this is the chapter we're introduced to the famous beast of Revelation. In fact,
Okay.
there's 2 beasts in Revelation 13. When I hear people talk, sometimes they say, well, they think the Antichrist this, the Antichrist that, and things like that. And when I tell them that the word Antichrist is only mentioned in 1st and 2nd John, and it's referring to people that there were many in John's day in the 1st century, and they denied the teachings of Christ. That's why they were Antichrist. They denied that Jesus came, was God in the flesh, and that his teachings were not followed. There were many, John says. And the typical response, Jimmy, is I have people say something like, well, the beast in Revelation is the Antichrist. Um, and one of the questions I ask them, just to kind of prod them a little bit, to get them to think, is I say, which beast? Because most people that say that are repeating it because they've heard somebody else say that, and they don't realize that in chapter 13 we find 2 different beasts. So, uh, anyway, this is not the Antichrist. We'll see that in a moment. We're going to see 2 different beasts in this chapter. One is going to be from the sea, and one is going to be from the land. And just as a quick recap, so where are we at? We're in Act 2 in this. And remember that the Act 2 is all about, now that Act 1 was about what Christ had accomplished and the victory that we have in Christ, and what he did to become king and to control the nations as his inheritance. Act 2 is, how do we fit into that? So now the focus then turns to the bride of Christ, which we saw in Revelation 12. At the beginning of Act 1, Scene 1, we see the bride of Christ is the woman that is now in a heavenly category. It's one of the wonders that we see in the heavens. And now we see this woman who is the faithful remnant. This is the faithful Israelites. These are the ones that are in covenant. This is the bride of Christ. This is her. And she is the one that actually then ends up delivering Christ, because Jesus comes through the faithful remnant. And then we see, of course, she is clothed with the Son. That's the presence of God. She's clothed with his presence. She on her crown, on her head is crown of 12 stars. Of course, we remember that's symbolic of both the tribes and now the apostles too. And we see the moon, which was used for times and for seasons, are now subject to her. They're under her feet. Okay, so we see this beautiful, beautiful vision in chapter 12. And then we also saw that the dragon was kicked out of heaven and so forth. Now, here in chapter 13, we're going to see two different beasts. The first one we're going to see is going to be the sea beast. Now, Jimmy, this chapter will flow, especially the verses we're covering today, are going to flow so very easily if we just get four different metaphors in our minds. And that's what I want to go over at the beginning here is four different metaphors. And so let's go ahead and go to Revelation 13 and verse 1, and we'll take these in order. But remember, as we've said before, Revelation is written like an exclamation point after a sentence that's already been written. This is pointing backwards to things that we've already heard before. It's assumed at this point that you don't start your Bible reading in Revelation. It's assumed that you're reading the end of a story. And so, us coming to Revelation and not acknowledging what's already been said it's kind of like that annoying person you're watching a movie with and they haven't been paying attention. It's the person that's been talking to somebody else. They've been in the kitchen getting snacks or whatever, and they come in the very, they go, who's that? Okay, now who's that? Now, why did you say that? And you're going, please stop talking. And this is, we don't want to be that person. And in Revelation, you don't want to come in and, start assuming that you know the connections when you haven't been following it. So it's assumed that the reader here is familiar with the metaphors that have already been given. These are all pointing back to things we should be familiar with in the Old Testament. So let's go ahead and read verse 1, and we're going to get these metaphors in order. Revelation 13:1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea. There's two of our metaphors. We're going to look at sand. We're going to look at sea. I saw a beast. There's our third one. And this beast was rising up out of the sea. So we're going to look at three metaphors. The first one that we're going to look at is the sand. Jimmy, if you could help me out again today, that's such a help when you do that.
Yeah.
Genesis chapter 22, Genesis 22 and verse 17. If you could do that, I'll write on the board.
All right. That in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies.
So in Genesis chapter 22, the first part of our metaphor that we see is actually God's promise to Abraham is that his lineage would be kind of like the sand of the sea. So we actually have both the descendants of Abraham, and also we actually even see the word sea in that one also. But 32:12, if you don't mind, Genesis 32:12.
And thou saidst, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.
So here we have, once again, it is the line of Abraham that is considered the sand of the sea. So let's go ahead and move on. So our first metaphor is sand. A lot of times the word sand is referring to descendants. Okay, let's go to our second one, which is going to be the word sea, or even the word deep. Now this gets very interesting. So I'm going to put sea/deep. Now this metaphor is so strong, Jimmy, that this is actually found in Genesis 1. You'll notice these are all early references, but this is going to be Genesis chapter 1 and verse number 2, if you are okay reading that.
And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
Okay, so here at the very, very beginning of the story, we see multiple metaphors that are going to be carried over. These are thoughts that are being carried over all the way through the Bible. And remember, this is God communicating to his creation. This is God taking a word picture for us. This is an ancient document, and God is using very, very obvious imagery to teach his creatures, us, about himself. And so he creates a world. He creates a world, and when he starts off explaining it, it's unformed and unfilled. That's what that void is talking about there. It's just not complete yet. It doesn't indicate destruction. And when it's formless and void, it's unformed and unfilled. And Then we talk about him looking in his spirit moves over the face of the deep. This is so important. So whenever we're talking about God's spirit, we're talking about his animated presence, his breath, his wind, the ruach, pneuma, all the same word, spirit, breath, wind. And this is the light. Think of the spirit of God as the life force of God. And when his life force moves over the face of the deep, then things begin to happen out of the chaos of the water, out of the instability of the water, structure appears. So you have chaos, the water metaphor in the Bible, the deep especially, is like the highest form of chaos, instability. And this metaphor carries all the way through the Bible. You read it in the Psalms. In Psalm 69, you talk about I'm in the mire, I'm in the muck, I'm in the sea, I'm in the depths. It's always a metaphor for instability and wickedness and sin. The opposite of that is a rock, sturdy foundation. Jesus is my rock. And the imagery is when his spirit, when his animating force moves over, his life giving presence moves over this instability, dry land appears. The dry land is a result of his presence. And so if land is a result of his spirit, then higher land is even more so a picture of God's presence. So we have the mountain theme is formed right here in Genesis as well, where we know Ezekiel 28 indicates that Eden was a mountain, the mountains of God, Jerusalem, a city set on a hill, the law given at Mount Sinai, Jesus giving us his instructions on the Mount of Olives and so forth. We see this mountain theme where it's elevated the farthest possible place away from the chaotic water. So the metaphor here is given. Let's just do a few rapid fires here. Genesis 7:11.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
So in the destruction of mankind, except for 8 people, it was that the Lord opened up the fountains of the abyss of the deep. So this is quite literally in the Jewish culture and the Jewish theology and the Jewish mind is the destruction of the whole world is when the Lord allows or forces this access to the deep. If I allow the deep to come into your life, I'm essentially killing you. That's the way they thought of it. Deuteronomy 8:7.
For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills.
So one of the positive parts of the Lord delivering them into a good land is, if you notice from that, is you have the benefits of the depths, but the depth you don't have to go to the depths to get it. It's actually coming to the surface in a safe way. So you see, even his blessings is talking about there's a buffer between you and the depths, but you're going to have springs from the depths. But you're going to have them in a safe way where there's a land buffer. That's why a well is so attractive and so forth. Job chapter 38, verse 16.
Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth?
When God is trying to communicate to Job that Job doesn't know as much as he thought he did, and when God is trying to minister to Job to try and put him in a right standings with himself, one of the questions he had for him was, "Are you able to search out the depths? Have you gone on an expedition in the depths?" Of course, the answer is no. It was one of the ways God used the depths or the abyss as a way of putting Job in his place, because Job knew that was out of bounds for him. That was a place that he would never be able to search. And God used that to show Job that. Psalm 42 in verse 7.
Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me.
And so here we see this metaphor then now is being used to show that God can use the deep to communicate with each other if he wants. So not only can we be destroyed by the deep, without God's presence, the deep will consume you. It's used to show Job that Job doesn't know what he's talking about because he can't even search the deep. But now we see that God has such power that he can use the deep calling on the deep. In other words, if you were in the middle of the ocean, you'd hear a crashing wave over here and you'd hear a crashing wave over here in stereo on either side of you. And the psalmist here is saying, who else could control the deep where the deep calls to the deep and the deep is answering the deep? Like in other words, he can manipulate the abyss, he can manipulate the deep. And that was one of the ways the psalmist was trying to express that God has such power where people are terrified of it, but God has control over these things. Now, the reason I'm going into such detail on this is because this word right here for the deep in Jewish theology was a place of evil spirits, a place of the unknown. There's all these kind of shades of this idea of just negative bad. And when we get into the Greek and we hear the word abyss, I want folks to understand this word deep right here and the word abyss and the words bottomless pit are all the same word. So now let's start putting this together because this is all the same word. So if you go to the bottomless pit, so Jimmy, if you don't mind reading Revelation 9:1.
And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit.
All right, and we've already studied the abyss and bottomless pit in Revelation 9:1. So this is the same word. So now, when we're talking about having the keys to the abyss, this should make more sense. The Spirit of God moved over the face of the deep, and dry land appeared. Stability out of chaos. That's the imagery of God's Spirit. And so here we see that this angel in Revelation 9, which we've already done a video on, is given a key to the deep, given a key to the abyss, the bottomless pit. And let's bring it home here. One more. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4.
And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years.
Okay, so we're talking here about the binding of Satan in Revelation 20, which is, by the way, the only place in the whole Bible. This 1,000 years is mentioned in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 7. You'll see it a few times. But here we're talking about the binding of Satan in this bottomless pit idea, and this all ties together with the binding of Satan. It'll all come together when we get to that point of our study, and it will make more sense. There's one other place I want to go. In Jewish theology, this reference to the deep and the abyss was also the place of monsters, the place of wicked evilness, and it was this idea of the realm of Satan, really. And let's show one example of that. If you could go to Luke chapter 8 and verses 26 through 31.
And they arrived at the country of the Gadarenes, which is over against Galilee. And when he went forth to land, there met him out of the city a certain man, which had devils long time, and wear no clothes, neither abode in any house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, and fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God Most High? I beseech thee, torment me not. For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For oftentimes it had caught him, and he was kept bound with chains and fetters, and he brake the bands, and was driven of the devil into the wilderness. And Jesus asked him, saying, What is thy name? And he said, Legion, because many devils were entered into him. And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the deep.
So this is a story we're all familiar with. I want you to notice that seemed to be an extreme case of demonic possession. It seemed to be a case of a legion, a high number, a multitude, if we will, of demons were in this one man. And they asked Jesus if he would be willing to not put them into the deep, the abyss. the bottomless pit. The idea of bottomless pit has the idea of stability. It would be like sinking. It would be the bottomless pit idea would be like sinking with rocks in your pockets and trying to jump up in the middle of the water. I mean, when you're going down, imagine kicking to try and get stability in the middle of the water while you're sinking down. That's the imagery that we have of bottomless pit. It means in the water, chaos. In fact, for those who want to look into this, the Hebrew letter mem has a pictogram that looks like this. That's the pictogram. Of course, that probably looks familiar. It looks like our M, and it's the letter mem. And the pictogram is supposed to be water. So when you think of M, waves, that's in the Hebrew mind. And the meaning of this pictogram literally is talking about chaos. Oops, see, I cannot write and talk. Is chaos. So this pictogram right here with this idea of a wave is always chaos, and that's actually built into the Hebrew language. So it's very, very interesting there. So we've already talked about sand being the line of Abraham. We've talked about the sea or the deep or the abyss is the place of scary, evil, negative, bad, and no stability. Basically the opposite of a mountain, where there's something you can get out of the chaos. And the mountain theme, and that's why the mountain theme is prevalent throughout Scripture, of the presence of God. On the mountain theme, he always gets alone in a mountain to pray. But we're going through Matthew in our church right now, and I mean, good grief! I feel like the last several chapters, we're in chapter 15. I feel like the last several chapters, all Jesus has been trying to do is get to the mountain alone to pray, and things keep getting in his way. If it wasn't sad, it would be comical how often he tries to get alone in a mountain, and then all of a sudden, 15,000 people are up there waiting for him, and they needed help. He's like, oh, just let the guy pray in a mountain. It's just an interesting theme. Our next metaphor we need to go over to help understand this is the word beast, the metaphor of beast. And that is also found very early on in Scripture. Jimmy, if you don't mind, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1.
Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?
In verse 7.
And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons.
In verse 21.
Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them.
So here's some interesting thoughts when we get into the beast metaphor in Genesis. First is, you read in chapter 3 and verse number 1 that Satan was contrasted or compared to a beast of the field. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field. So we're already putting into this category of beast. The theming is we're having a connection here with Satan. And then we learned that this is so vitally important that people get this. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, that is when they realized there was shame in being seen. There was shame in being naked. There was shame in being unclothed. And this is where our clothing or our robing metaphor and theming take over from Genesis 3, where Jesus is providing a covering, the Feast of Booths, a covering for you. And Jesus then covers the world with his blood and so forth. There's a robe given to the saints. They're given a white garment and so forth to get into the wedding. This theme is all the way back here. But very interestingly, they then decided to take things upon themselves, and they decided to cover themselves, but they did it with vegetation. They did it with the results of a plant or a tree. In this case, it was a fig leaf. They sewed together, and they tried to cover their shame, which is the result of their sin, through a fig leaf. This is exactly what Cain did. Cain was supposed to take an animal sacrifice, but he did it. He took a harvest sacrifice of vegetables and plant life and vegetation, and it was not pleasing to the Lord. Here's Adam and Eve basically did the same thing. They're trying to cover their own result of sin, their shame, their nakedness. They're uncovering before God. They did it with this non-biblical way, but it was much more clean to do it the way they did. I mean, I'm going to cover myself. Remember, nothing had died yet. This is pre. They have nothing. They've never seen anything die.
Yeah.
It's not like you or I, where we could go. I have a lot of hunter friends, and when they go out hunting, they call it harvesting. We were able to harvest an elk. Like, you mean kill?
Yeah.
But they call it harvesting because they're providing for their family and they're harvesting the crop of elk, and we have things to eat in that case, and so forth. So, but Adam and Eve had never seen anything die. It wasn't like they're familiar with this. So they obviously, if they see all these animals around them and they see a big, huge, leafy tree, their thought would, let's just cover ourselves with that. But the Lord says, not good enough, right? We see in verse number 21 that you read, Jimmy, that it was God who covered them with the skins of animals. It was the coats of animals. Now, I'm sure folks can understand that animals don't voluntarily give you their skins. This is done by force. This is done by having to kill the animals. And think through this with me. It's not like God then he didn't go to the tanner. He didn't go to the leather shop and stretch out the skins and put oils on there, put a stain on there, and put it out in the sun. No, he killed them and he put it on them. What would that do? Well, that would result in the bloody residue of these animals to be on Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
This is the result of sin. Bloodiness. Hey, listen, here's the theming of beast. Satan is more subtle than any beast of the field. Sin tells me that I'm naked and need to be covered. And as a result of that, I'm covered with the blood of a beast. In other words, if you're going to act like a beast, you're going to look like a beast. Adam became beast-like because of his sin. He took on the blood of a beast and covered to cleanse his own blood. And now he's tainted with the blood of a beast to cover his own shame and nakedness. So very, very important theming there. There's kind of a long passage here in Daniel chapter 4. And Jimmy, I'll go ahead and read that if that's okay, because I'm going to make comments along the way. And it might be difficult for me I don't want to, interject while you're reading, if that's all right.
Okay.
It'll be maybe a little easier. So Daniel chapter 4, we're going to go in verses 19 through 37. So a little bit of a narrative here. And the reason this is important, Daniel 4, 19 through 37, is this is one of those amazing stories that we see in Daniel remember, there's a series of Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Nobody can interpret the dream. Daniel interprets the dream and so forth. Well, this is an important one because it has to do with our beast theming. We're going to start this one in 19. This is the story of Nebuchadnezzar having the dream about the tree. Remember the tree that reaches all the way to the heavens? This is that story. So very, very fascinating stories. Let's go ahead and read together. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished. That means that he was perplexed, astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. The tree which thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of heaven in their habitation. It is thou, O king. Thou art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto the heaven, and thy dominion unto the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with the band of iron and brass and the tender grass in the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. So let's just kind of pause for a moment, understand what we're reading. So Daniel is saying that You, Nebuchadnezzar, you're this tree. You're like this tree that has gone all the way up to the heaven, and everybody benefits from your kingdom. Everybody benefits from this kingdom that you run in Babylon. Everybody has shelter and food from this. But then you notice that there's a holy one that comes down from heaven and commands that the tree is cut down, but to not take the root system out, just to take the tree down. The tree's going to fall over, but there's still a root system in the ground. So that's where we're at so far. Verse number 25. That they shall drive thee from men, thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree of the roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee. After that, thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. So, so what the prophecy here is of this interpretation, Daniel is saying, here's what's going to happen. When your kingdom is chopped down, when the tree comes down, you are going to see a loss of kingdom, and you're going to lose your mind. You are going to go out with the beasts of the field. You're going to get the dew on you just like the beasts of the field do. And you're going to not understand. And then 7 times the reminder is going to come to you. You're going to pass right over. You're not going to get it. But when you do finally come to your senses and you recognize that it is the God of heaven who has all authority over every kingdom, when you recognize that, then you will then again be able to recognize that it is God who has given you this ability to run this kingdom. Very odd relationship here that we're seeing with a Gentile king, really, and the God of Israel. So let's move on. Verse 27. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it be a lengthening of thy tranquility. And all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. Now let's pause for a moment. Daniel just warned Nebuchadnezzar. This is the warning. Your kingdom is going to come down because you're not acknowledging that God is in charge of all kings. You're going to lose your mind. You're going to live with the beasts like the beasts of the field. And this is going to come upon you because you're not acknowledging who God is.
Well, I'll acknowledge him right now then. How's that?
That's how I would respond. That's exactly how I would respond. But here's what Nebuchadnezzar thought he would do. So all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar in verse 29, and at the end of 12 months, so 12 months go by, he walked into the palace of the kingdom of Babylon, took a deep breath and beat on his chest, and the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? So, yeah, 12 months, and he, decided to ignore Daniel's interpretation of the dream and goes out on his palace balcony and looks around and says, "Look what I have done! I have done such a great and marvelous thing by the might of my own hand." Now it says here, verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling, important, shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou knowest that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will." The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird claws. Verse 34. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. In other words, I'm getting out of the beast-like state. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and the kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? So Nebuchadnezzar's having a revival here. Verse 36. At the same time, my reasoning returned to me, and for my glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me. My counselors and my lord sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom. An excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways in judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase or make low. Now, very interesting here, because Nebuchadnezzar, a Gentile king, is told by Daniel that if he doesn't acknowledge who God is in his kingdom, he's going to lose his kingdom and he's going to become like a beast, act like a beast. He does this, in fact, and we find that he's actually grunting around, rolling around, losing his mind. His nails are long, his hair is long, and he can't begin to reason, and he's living with the beasts.
It always amazed me to think that, and this went on for 7 years, and nobody in his kingdom thought to maybe put him away or end his life or anything. They just let him roam around in this field for 7 years.
It's an amazing story. He comes to his senses then, and of course he reasons and acknowledges that the Lord is who he is, and his reasoning comes back to him, and he gains back his former kingdom and splendor. Now, this is kind of interesting. I won't get into this in this passage, but Solomon is about the opposite of this. Solomon is the lamb-like figure who turns into a beast.
Yeah.
So Solomon, actually, that's interestingly, even his name, the root of his name means peace, shalom, Solomon. And so he starts off as a lamb, and then he turns into a beast. Where here, Nebuchadnezzar is a beast-like figure who then turns into more like a lamb kind of figure. So they kind of swap places with the Gentile role, and the Jewish role is very, very interesting here.
Did Nebuchadnezzar end his days on the good side?
It appears to be in chapter 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. Seems like the man got saved from, the terminology we would use.
Yeah.
So that's so we can summarize beast like this. Beast is somebody in authority, usually always in authority. So, of course, Adam, our federal head, we call him. Somebody in authority who should recognize Jesus, or should recognize the Lord as in charge of everything. They're warned about it, and they turn their back and they reject God. We see that in Adam and Eve. We see that in Nebuchadnezzar. And they take on characteristics of Satan. Then they are referred to as a beast. Okay. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more in the book of Daniel when we get into our text. But let's go to our last metaphor. Our last metaphor here is going to be a sea monster, which a lot of people don't realize a sea monster is a part of our text in the book of Genesis. But a sea monster is definitely part of our text. Now, another way that we can say sea monster is we could say the phrase beast, a sea beast, sometimes it's called, or another terminology we use is a serpent, that with the emphasis on it being in the water. So sea monster, beast, serpent, all of these, this terminology is used in the Bible, and I'll show you right here. Let's go to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 21.
And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good.
So the word here, whales, does not mean Shamu. It is not talking about an orca. That's not what this word means. And so if you go ahead, and I encourage people to do this, but I'll just tell you what it is. It's the Hebrew word tannin. And this word has to do, even if you look at Blue Letter Bible, I looked at it just before we did this, just for simplicity. It says at the very top of that this word tannin means dragon, it means serpent, it means sea monster. And so this is in the deep that God created. He also created creatures to represent the terrifying aspects of the abyss. And these sea monsters, whatever they were, are not like I said, not like a beautiful Shamu kind of thing. This, whatever this is a sea monster. The Bible refers to this over and over again. This is what's being referred to in Job as Leviathan.
Mm.
So Leviathan is the sea version of the sea monster. And then later in Revelation 13, we're going to get into the behemoth idea, which is more like a land dwelling monster. So, really, Revelation 13, I know in David Chilton's book, he even entitles this chapter Leviathan and Behemoth, because it's carrying over the theming of the sea monster, which is Leviathan, and then the land monster or beast, which is the behemoth.
Mm.
So you have both of those in Revelation 13. But it's very important to understand that this word whales, that's translated whales, I encourage people, do a little digging on that, do a little word study on that. You'll find this is not talking about your average, blue whale or something. Okay.
And I saw the video you did this past week on walking through Blue Letter Bible. So if anybody doesn't know how to use it, go to Ken's YouTube channel, it's just Bible for Family, right?
Yep.
And go watch that video. It was very helpful. And
Yeah.
I know how to use it, but I still found value because there was a couple other things that I didn't know. So yeah, thank you
good.
for that video.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Blue Letter Bible is a good resource. And then I think your preface is eSword, though, isn't it? I believe.
I use eSword, but
yes. So we'll do that one next time.
Okay. Yeah, but
they're both good resources. Free.
Yeah.
That's the best part. Free is right in my budget.
Yeah, exactly. I like eSword because of there's a lot of resources out there that you can add into it. A lot of different commentaries, a lot of different lexicons and dictionaries and things like that. So
absolutely. So we've gone over 4 metaphors that will help us for Revelation 13. And so we've gone over the sand, the sea or the deep. We've gone over the beast in general, and then we've gone over a sea monster. And it kind of feels like we're saying, fantasy stuff, but that's literally what it is. And now that we have that kind of knowledge and the metaphors here, now the chapter will be pretty easy. We'll just say pretty easy. It'll still be fun. It's complex in the sense that it has a lot of details, but it's not. It doesn't mean it's intellectually difficult or anything. It's very simple actually, but it's complex in the sense that there's a lot of details to it. So let's go ahead and start in Revelation 13:1, and we're just going to do these first 4 verses. In Revelation 13:1, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So the idea here is that John is in his vision is standing on top of the sea sand, but he's looking. Now remember, John wrote this from Patmos, and when he's looking over the Mediterranean, he's looking towards Rome. And so he's seeing out of the Mediterranean in his vision this sea beast rise up out. And this beast has, it says, 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. And then he adds one more detail, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Now, we don't have to guess what this is. I see a lot of commentaries where people are guessing. The Bible tells us what this is. Let's go ahead and look at the interpretation of this. It's found in Revelation 17 in 9 through 12.
And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was, and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast.
Okay, so here we have basically the interpretation. There's no reason to really wonder about this. We say that the seven heads are representative of we know where they're from. They're 7 kings or 7 leaders, but We specifically know it's from Rome because this is the famous 7 hills in Rome. It's like these leaders are represented by the 7 famous hills in Rome. Now, there's a lot of detail in Revelation 17, and we'll get into that when we get to Revelation 17, so I don't want to focus too much. But it also tells us that these horns are like governors or kings. They're a progression. So remember the line of Caesars. We talked about this in the dating of Revelation. So the one that is Nero. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get into Revelation 17. We've already touched on that in our dating of the book of Revelation. But for now, all we really need to know is that the purpose the Holy Spirit has in Revelation is to reveal Jesus Christ. This is not meant to be an expansive historical document explaining to us every detail about Rome. But what it is a covenantal treaty that's telling us in covenantal terms the story of Jesus in his dealing with the apostasy of Israel and the bride of Christ. That's all that's trying to be communicated here. We're not going to this to be able to find the history of Rome. Suetonius would be a good resource for that. That's not what we're trying to get across here. So if you think that there's a lot of important details missing from the aspect of Rome, it was never intended to be that. We learn in chapter 1, of course, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ to the 7 churches as a warning to make sure you're right with God when you're going through this terrible, terrible time in the area of emperor worship of these 7 churches. And so that's the purpose here. But we learn, for the sake of today and what we're trying to accomplish, we can see coming out of the sea, out of the abyss, out of the place of uncertainty and chaos and not knowing, towards the Gentile empire of Rome, we see this monster from the water that can't be so easily killed with a headshot, a head wound. And so there's 7 heads. And in fact, we can see this lines up with the succession of Caesars and so forth. So we'll get into the horns and the crowns. One thing I want to mention in verse number 1 is it says, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Now, Chilton said this. He said, according to the Roman imperial theology, the Caesars were gods. Each emperor was called Augustus or Sabastus, meaning one to be worshipped. They also took on the name of Divus or God, or even Deus or Theos, meaning God. So when these guys were introducing themselves, many times they would even introduce themselves by starting off by saying, "Hi, I'm God so-and-so." And, that was a name that was attributed to the Caesars. It was completely blasphemous. The cities that we're talking about here, the 7 churches, all of them had emperor worship in them. And so this is a heavy, heavy emperor worship idea. And so, of course, it would make sense that the beast, what is beast in this case? It is all of Rome put together. The sea, as we've learned in previous lessons, the sea is representative of the Gentiles. So, of course, this is the Gentile world power beast that has not recognized God, the God of the Bible, the one true living God, as their king. And so in this sense, they have become beast-like in this sense. So this is what we're seeing in Revelation chapter 13 in verse number 1. Let's move on to verse 2. John begins to describe him further and says, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. His mouth was as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Now, we already learned in chapter 12 who the dragon is. The dragon is Satan. It's that old serpent, the devil, connected back to Genesis 3:15. And so we know who that is. Mm-hmm. So now we know who the beast is and we know who the dragon is. The beast is Rome in its entity, the whole world dominating power of the Roman Empire. And then this Roman Empire has unique leaders along the way that we're calling heads of the Roman Empire. And they can be swapped out. It's not important for this, the story. It might be Nero here. And then, of course, we're going to see Nero is going to kill himself. And there's going to be a time of civil war. Remember, in our dating of Revelation, we have in AD 69, the year of 4 emperors, when everybody thought the world was ending because Rome was in a full-out civil war. And how scary to think the only world power was at war with itself. And that's going to be reflected also in our chapter here. And so we have this imagery in verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto now let's keep in track here. A leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear. His mouth was as the mouth of a lion. And on top of that, another entity, the dragon, which is Satan, gave him his power and his seat. That's talking about authority. And it reiterates, and great authority. Now, we have already heard about some sort of a beast that looks just like this. This is a callback to Daniel chapter 7 and verses 4 through 6. Jimmy, if you don't mind. Daniel 7, verses 4 through 6.
The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it.
So here we see the imagery that is in the book of Daniel. He's getting a vision of the beast. And I should have had you read this, but in verse number 3, in context, it says, And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, diverse from one another. Now, the description that we see of the beast coming up out of the sea in Revelation 13 is the exact same descriptions, but we see it in reverse order. Remember, here in this one, we see a lion, and then we see a bear, and then we see a leopard. And it's the opposite that we see in Revelation 13. But it's important to note that the 4th beast of Daniel is a combination of the first 3 beasts. So when we have these distinct characteristic of a beast, when we get to the 4th beast in Daniel, it's like a combination. It's like the worst of the worst. The 4th beast in Daniel is a combination of the first 3 beasts all put together. Like, man, if you thought a lion was bad, or you thought a bear was bad, or you thought a leopard was bad, and of course we're talking about a lion with its ability to hunt and its ability to crouch and its quickness combination. A bear, just extreme power. If a bear gets a hold of you, it's over. You gotta stay away from the bear. But then, my goodness, then we combine that with a leopard, known for its speed. You have a mass killing machine. And the 4th imagery of the beast is all these military characteristics. The fourth beast in Daniel is a combination of the previous 3. Now, let's go ahead and head back to Daniel chapter 2. And this is the famous story of, as you can see, we'll probably end up doing most of Daniel trying to do this study, but it would be good for us at some point to do Daniel verse by verse also. But in Daniel chapter 2, in verses 36 through 40, we're going to see Daniel and the image that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, another dream image. We've already talked about one in Daniel 4, but this time it's the image of the statue. Remember the statue image? What we know the statue image really was is actually a chronological prophecy of successive kingdoms. So we know that the top of the image was gold, that was representative of Babylon. And then we know as we move down the statue, there's 4 kingdoms being talked about. It goes in order: the Babylonians, the Medo-Persian Empire, then Alexander the Great takes over, the Grecian Empire, the Greeks, and then the Roman Empire is the 4th one. And so the Roman Empire is a combination in being terrifying of the first 3 kingdoms all combined. Rome was the bad boy at the end. That's where Jesus was born, into that empire. So that's what this is talking about in Daniel chapter 2. Let's go ahead and read together in Daniel 2. We'll just read 36 through 40 and then 44 and 45.
This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. Now 44 and 45. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. But it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure.
So here, Jimmy, we have something here that I don't think anybody even argues this. I believe that futurists, as well as those that would view some of this already being fulfilled, I think both camps are on the same page in Daniel chapter 2, that I've always heard this taught this way my whole life, that the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kingdom, and then it's taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's taken over by the Grecian Empire in the intertestamental period with Alexander the Great, and that's then dominated by Rome. And here's the key to this thing. Here's the key to this thing. Very, very clearly stated in verse 44, Daniel says, and in the days of these kings. What kings? Well, the succession of kingdoms that we just talked about. So in the days of these kings, you don't have the ability grammatically, you don't have the ability in flow of thought in the whole point of the book. You don't have the ability to say, oh, this must be in our future about America. It's not what it's talking about. It literally says here, in the days of these kings, which puts you in the first century, what's going to happen? The God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And so the imagery then, there's one other part to this thing to make the whole thing very clear. So that you have this great statue that it's going all the way up, and we have these successive kingdoms in order: Babylon, Medes and Persians, Grecian, Roman Empire. And then the toes, if you remember, the toes are a mixture of clay and of iron. Now you've always heard Rome rules with this rod of iron idea. And Rome is known for this iron, this being tough. But there's a weakness in the toes, in the foundation. It's mixed with clay. And so we're going to see the Roman Empire starting to have weaknesses, especially when we're heading towards the destruction of the temple. AD 69, that civil war that seeps in, the year of the four emperors start to seep in, and there's a lot of turmoil and infighting in the Roman Empire. And so the imagery then is, if you can believe this, Daniel looks over and he sees in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, once he sees this great image, successive kingdoms, he then looks over and he sees a mountain. And out of the mountain it says this right here, a little stone is formed, and it says, without hands. Wow, a little stone is formed without hands. This is a reference, I believe, to the virgin birth of Christ. Jesus is this little stone right here, and there was no man involved. But this is a reference to, I believe, the virgin birth of Christ through Mary. And here we see in the dream a little tiny stone made without hands comes over, and it just hits the great image right on the toe. And I can almost imagine hits the toe, and a little tiny hairline fracture starts, seemingly insignificant. A little hairline fracture starts, and Jesus dies on the cross, and Jesus resurrects, and he commissions the 120 in the upper room, and all of a sudden the book of Acts is a bloodbath where the gospel is beginning to take over and it's starting to destroy the Roman Empire from the inside out, not with military might or not with weapons. Peter, put away your sword. We're going to do this thing through love and by the gospel and through faith. And the Roman Empire begins to crumble, and that little hairline fracture begins to go throughout all the feet and all the foundation, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. And then he looks over in his dream and he sees that little stone that hit the giant, the image, and that little stone then, progressive word, becomes a mighty mountain. That's the gospel growing as time goes on, as Jesus says that even the gates of hell itself cannot begin to stop this movement that we're calling the Church of Jesus Christ. And so here we see a very clear reference to exactly what we're learning about. That let's go ahead and head back now to Revelation chapter 13. So we see now, maybe this will make more sense. Verse number 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto, now we have these characteristics of the first three empires, was like unto, now this is one beast. So according to Daniel chapter 7, which one beast had the characteristics of these first three beasts? What was the last one? Remember, the fourth beast is the one that took on all the characteristics. So it couldn't be any clearer that this is talking about, this beast is the Roman Empire, which had characteristics of the Babylonian, the Medes and Persians, and the Grecian Empire. It's the fourth beast.
But I like my future revelation, Ken. You're just ruining this.
I'm sorry. Trust me, I want to sell books too. I'm not going to sell any books like this. So, yeah, I know. The story is what it is. I can't change it, but it's pretty plain here.
It's pretty clear.
It's pretty clear. So now we see the characteristics of everything that was described in the days of Daniel, of this being the Roman Empire that conquered the Grecian Empire. And in the days of these kings, God would set up his forever kingdom. What the text says. Now, how did Rome get its power? From Satan. That's all verse 2 means. Okay, let's move on to verse 3. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and the world wandered after the beast. Now, this has been used. I remember when I was a dispensationalist, I saw a movie that I thought was just so powerful. It's so amazing. And now I just am so embarrassed by it. It was called The Omega Code, if anybody has seen The Omega Code. The Omega Code is a Christian movie that tries to talk about kind of like a Left Behind sort of theme. And one of the world leaders is shot in the head, and everybody sees him die. And then he is then possessed by Satan and comes back to life. And everybody's like, wow. And they see him as like a Jesus type figure who has power over death. And that is all based on this one verse, that there's going to be a future. I just want folks to see how we're doing this study, how we're going back and letting the Bible interpret itself in the days of these kings, things which must shortly take place, the times that Jesus was alive in the first century. And then I want people to see in verse 3, here's what it actually says. Now, all the teaching you've ever heard your whole life on a future singular leader, let's call him the Antichrist. Even though that word isn't mentioned anywhere for a singular future leader, let's call him the Antichrist. That'll be good. And then if anybody asks us why that's not Revelation, we'll say, well, it's the beast of Revelation. Same person. Let's just combine those ideas. Let's make it the same person because, why not? That helps our thing here. And in verse 3, clearly he dies with probably a gunshot wound, and then he's resurrected. That sounds good. Jimmy, none of that's accurate. And actually, let's read it very slowly and look at what it says. See if somebody can catch this. And I saw one of his heads. That's the heads of the beast. We know there's 7 of them. We're looking at one of them. I'm looking at one of his heads as it were wounded to death. As it were.
Aha.
What is as it were? As it were is a simile.
It's like. It's not.
It's
as if.
It's as if.
It's not literal.
He didn't die. It's not a head wound on any of them. It's as if it was one, but it wasn't one. Now look at this. It's as if it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Wow, I thought this was the end of it, but it's not. It's as if it were wounded unto death. Okay, so even in the one text, the one verse that people use to create a future Antichrist with a gunshot wound to the head that clearly dies and is resurrected, and everybody's amazed. This is where everybody's getting that from, and it's not even what it says. And so, talk about flimsy, it's totally made up. Now, if you didn't go slow like we are, somebody could show you that verse and you could go, oh, okay, well, I guess I don't know enough to refute you. Yeah, it sounds like somebody's, I guess, shot in the head or whatever and comes back to life.
Yeah,
but that's not what it says.
Well, this Antichrist is also a guy walking around with 7 heads, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or 10,
that's the point.
It was.
That's the point. You just nailed it. And that goes back to the very first video you and I ever made, which is why I'm so passionate about the art of interpretation, the rules of interpretation. You have to be consistent when you're interpreting. If you're going to take this to be a future Antichrist, which is not in the text anywhere, dies with a gunshot wound to the head and is resurrected, which is not found in the text anywhere, you nailed it. You're making this setting in time and space a real person that goes through these things, and you're ignoring then you're choosing what's literal and what's metaphorical, what's illustration, what's vision, and what's future historical narrative. And they're mixing all of these genres and they're mixing interpretive rules. You're exactly right. If this is a future literal person, he should have 7 heads. But they will never agree to that, right?
Yeah.
Here's what's really going on. When John looks over at this sea monster, the sea beast out of the abyss, which means it's Rome, mixing all of our metaphors, it's Rome being controlled by the power of the abyss or given over to Satan. That's all we're talking about there. The dragon gives it its power. That there appears for a time that it starts to die, but it doesn't. And I think what we're talking about here is the civil war in AD 69, the year of the 4 emperors. It looked like the Roman Empire was going under, and then it got its act together in 70. And we're talking about the destruction of the temple in 70. So there was another resurgence. So I think that's what this is talking about here. And also, there's another reason that we have here. And let me just pan back for a second and just show this. Where else in the Bible do I, and I say this all the time if you hear me teach, this is the whole point of the whole Bible. This is the plot of the Bible. What is the plot of the Bible found in Genesis 3:15, where we see a beast that's going to get a head wound, right? It's that famous passage in Genesis 3:15. It's the plot line of the whole Bible that the Lord is speaking to Satan. He says that there's going to be a division. We're going to make a division here. The division will be between the people who follow you and the people that follow me. And the one that comes from that woman right there, which is ultimately the woman we see in Revelation 12, the in covenant women that becomes the bride of Christ, which is all of us covenantally, that one's going to give birth to something that's going to crush your head. So we should be thinking in terms, when John is writing this, we should be thinking in terms of a beast with a head-like wound. This one isn't quite it, but man, it kind of feels like it. So when Rome is going through a civil war, when they're going through internal fighting, and it seems like their kingdom is destroyed, it seems like it, but then it's going to kind of get its strength back together and finish the campaign in Jerusalem. And it's going to be in that campaign in Jerusalem when the temple is destroyed and God has Satan do his dirty work and just decimate the old covenant. That is when actually Satan's head will be crushed. His head was crushed in one sense at the cross. Judicially, he's been done since the resurrection. Judicially, he's been done since the death of Jesus. The resurrection is just a whole other level of the new covenant. Satan's been crushed since then, technically. But now, civilly speaking, it's going to be made public when the temple is destroyed. In Romans chapter 16, Paul says that shortly, Satan will be crushed under your feet. A reference again back to Genesis 3:15. So he says shortly in Romans chapter 16. Here's another thought too. If you would, Jimmy, could you turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 22? Philippians 4:22.
All the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household.
This is absolutely remarkable. Paul is saying in his letter to the Philippians, remember he's writing from jail, and he's saying in his letter to the Philippian church, the church at Philippi, he's saying, hey, Please say hi to all these people for me. There's a listing. And then he says all the people that are saying hi back to them. In verse 22, we learn, can you believe this? That people of Caesar's family are getting saved and are a part of the church. And Paul is passing on a greeting from Caesar's family members to the church at Philippi. It was already happening.
Wow.
Even before AD 70, it was already happening. Satan's head was being crushed by the gospel. Listen, Rome, you could go on, some kind of history channel thing on YouTube, and you can listen to them talk all day long about why the Roman Empire fell. It's one of the biggest enigmas in history that we have. How did the Roman Empire fall? How could something as strong as Rome fall? I can tell you how it fell. It's very simple. It fell because of Christianity. The Christians took over Rome, and Rome's identity was so disgusting. Nero was so depraved. We've talked about this a lot before, but read Josephus on Nero. Nero would skin people alive just to hear them scream. He would skin children and wear their coats in front of their moms. Horrific, horrific pit of hell stuff. He would light people on fire to light paths of people walking at night. The Christians, he would do that too. Nero was a sick person and a total pervert, and he was as bad as they come. He was a very beast-like creature. And here we see that Rome was experiencing, those that were in Caesar's household were starting to get saved. And so we can see that even in Philippians chapter 4. So it was already happening. That's why Rome fell. Their identity with Satan fell. And by the time Constantine got there, he probably, for political reasons, had to start making some concessions. That these Christians need to have these concessions because they're our majority population here.
Yeah.
So anyway, a different topic, but we can get that another time.
But that is what history tells us, that the Christian population was growing so big that Constantine knew that he had to somehow incorporate them into his world, or it was going to be over.
That's exactly right, and that is why we need to be aware of what the Roman Catholic Church is. The Roman Catholic Church was a great compromise, and we can talk about that historically another time, where they took pagan practices and tried to satisfy both sides by adding some things of Jesus and some things of the pagan practices. And out of that birth and that big stirring pot came out the Roman Catholic Church, and we can talk about that another time. Verse number 4 goes on to say this, and they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Now, the they here is very important. The they here is, let me go back. I didn't touch on this. In verse number, where do I want to see this at? Is the people that are in all the world. Is that in 2? Oh, okay, 3. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed in all the world. That's actually that word. If people want to do a study on that word world, that's not the same word like for God so loved the world. That's for God so loved the cosmos. Cosmos in Greek, but we would say cosmos. This is not all the people of the cosmos. This is actually the word land. And so we talk about earth, world, land. It depends on what Greek word is used. This is all the people in the land. And I'll just say this to save time because we'll develop this later in the chapter. This is talking about the land of Israel. And so the land reference here, remember, we're talking about land versus sea. Land here, we're going to see this with our behemoth in this chapter, the land beast. We have one more beast to go, and it's going to be apostate Israel. But the land here is Israel. So it literally is saying in verse number 3, that all of the land of Israel marveled. Now, this is not speaking about those that are the woman. The woman here, and that is that you're starting to see the wisdom of now the covenantal woman, the church, the bride of Christ, is now pictured as in heaven at this point. It's separating the two groups. So you can see one of these is pictured positionally in Christ, although they're living on the land. We're going to take them in a category and put them in Christ. So now the ones that are pictured as on the land are out of covenant, although in reality, there was a smattering and people were living next to each other on the actual land. But for the sake of the imagery, the ones in covenant are in heaven, positionally in Christ.
Then we have people that are on the land here. So when it says all the world wondered, it's all the land of Israel, all the ones that were out of covenant wondered. And so that's the they of verse 4. That's why I had to go through the hoops there. And they worshiped the dragon. Now, who's the dragon? That's straight up satanic worship. They straight up worshiping Satan at this point, because they knew it was Satan that was giving power to Rome. Remember all these stories in the Bible, in the ministry of Christ, where they would go and appeal to Rome about killing Jesus? They knew they would have no chance of killing Jesus with their own laws. And so their loophole they thought was so brilliant was they thought, if he's the king, if he's saying he's the king, then all we have to do is know that he broke the law, that Caesar is king. So if we tell the Romans that this one from Nazareth thinks he's the king of the world, well, he can't even be king of the Jews. It's maybe a death penalty for him. So they were trying to use leverage. So you always see the Pharisees trying to be in the presence of the Roman officials and tell on Jesus. In other words, they were really riding the authority of Rome. And later we're going to find that the harlot rides the beast until the beast bucks off the harlot and devours her. That's the story of Revelation. That's the story of what we're getting at, is the harlot, the ones out of covenant, that's why the 144,000 are referred to as virgins. They're not virgins physically on the earth in their lives. It doesn't mean they're not married. But this has the idea that they're a pure bride before Christ. They've not taken part in spiritual adultery. They are in covenant with God. They're virgins in the sense that they are true to their husband. They are not defiled with sexual, in this case, spiritual impurities. They're pure before God, as opposed to the great harlot. I mean, throughout the whole Bible, we've heard Israel be called the harlot, the whore, the harlot, all throughout. In fact, there's parts of the prophets that I can't remember which prophet right now. I think it might have been Isaiah, that he looked up and down the road and he said, let's look as far as we can down this way down the road. Let's look as far as we can down this way down the road. And he just basically says, is there anybody you guys haven't slept with? And he's talking spiritually. They're going after this God and after that God. He says, let's go to the highways and hedges and try to find someone you haven't slept with. And then this is actually in the text. We'll have to find this. He actually says, and you're not even a good prostitute. A normal prostitute at least gets paid. You get used and abused and left with no payment. You guys are stupid. That's what he's saying to them. That's how much Israel is said to be the whore or the harlot. So that's what we have. The harlot in Revelation, we're going to see this in our passages, riding on the beast. So that's the harlot is using the beast or riding the beast to kill Jesus, and they think it's working until one thing happens. The beast is then going to buck them off and destroy them. That's the story. Rome is going to destroy apostate Israel after apostate Israel used them to kill Jesus. And they worshiped the dragon, verse 4, which gave power onto the beast. And then they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Now, just a couple more passages, and we'll call it for this right here. I want to read you a quote by Milton Terry, and actually Milton Terry is going to be quoting Josephus here, but I want to give him credit. He says this: according to Josephus, the honors which were demanded by the Caesars included, among other things, that all subjects of the empire in all the provinces should build altars and temples to him, treat him as they would treat other gods, and even swear by his name. And that's in Antiquities 18:1. Let's go ahead and let's conclude this by going to John chapter 19 and verses 12 through 15. John 19, 12 through 15.
And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar.
Oof, oof.
Woo!
Bad choice, guys. We have no king but Caesar.
Mm.
You know, and what shall we do with this one? Crucify him. Let's go to a parallel passage in Matthew chapter 27 and verses 24 and 25. Matthew 27, 24 and 25.
When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children.
Oh, just gives me shivers. Why would they? That's how much they hated Jesus. Why would they double down and say, "And on our children"? Remember the time where Jesus is. I can't remember the passage off the top of my head, but we've gone over this before. When Jesus is on the way, he's trying to carry the cross, and one of the women were weeping for him because he looked so terrible. And he looked in that moment and he said, "Don't cry for me." He said, "Cry for yourselves and for your children."
That's in the Luke version, I think,
That's in
of
Luke.
the
Okay,
crucifixion.
man, that just in that moment, in all the agony Christ was in, can almost imagine him just shaking, saying, "Cry for yourself, not for me, and for your children." Oh, that further illustrates, Jimmy, the dating of the Book of Revelation. Why would he say that to somebody? Cry for yourselves and for your children. Why would they cry for their children? Because in that generation, the temple would be destroyed, and this is what we're talking about in Revelation, in the Great Tribulation. The dating of Revelation. Yes, you can go to that video of ours and you can watch it and learn about some of the bullet points of why we think that. But really, for those of you who are hanging with us in this study and watching it every video, you see now the greatest dating of Revelation is just to understand what Revelation is about, just to read it. Read it according to Daniel. In the days of these kings, I mean, it's just the whole thing is about the first century and Rome's destruction on the apostate Israelites and the Roman Jewish war of the first century, and then ultimately the Christians then taking over the Roman Empire. But we'll put a pin in it. We'll start in verse 5 in our next video.